Something happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, in the fall of 1857, but the local authorities buried it so deep that it took more than a century for rumors to come to light. A slave named Samson is said to have killed his master on Thanksgiving night at what was once Pulaski County's most opulent plantation home by snapping Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge's neck like a dry twig with his bare hands. What sets this story apart from other slave revolt stories, however, is that witnesses said Samson's strength that night was inhuman, able to bend iron tools into pretzel shapes, crush a man's skull with one hand, and leave handprints pressed so deeply into oak beams that they can still be seen today. The entire episode was removed from local media, the witnesses were hushed, and the official documents were sealed. What actually took place that Thanksgiving on Rutledge Plantation? And why, for the rest of their lives, did 3 different county officials maintain that what they witnessed that evening was beyond the realm of reason? Because tonight's story may be closer to your hometown than you might think, please hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments which state you're listening from. Before we continue with the story of Samson and the secrets hidden beneath Rutledge Plantation, 20 miles south of Little Rock in the center of Arkansas Territory, the story opens as the Arkansas River meanders through some of the most fertile bottomland cotton area in the South. Nearly 200 enslaved people labored on Rutledge Plantation, which had expanded to more than 3,000 acres by 1857. They lived beneath the massive Greek Revival mansion owned by Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, a lawyer from Massachusetts who had relocated to the South in his 20s in search of easy money through cotton speculating. Rutledge was a man of contrasts. Rutledge had chosen the system, in contrast to many plantation owners who were born into it. He ruled his farm with a deliberate harshness that even his neighbors were startled by, possibly as a result of that decision. He maintained thorough breeding charts for his human property, meticulously documented punishments, and was well known throughout Pulaski County for his scientific approach to managing slaves. At Rutledge Plantation, the slaves were housed in 2 separate areas. The house servants resided in slightly superior quarters near the main house, while the field hands lived in rough-hewn cottages by the river. It was a world of clandestine discussions, secret information, and generation-old survival techniques. Rutledge's predecessor, a softer man who had sold out when the colonel arrived with Southern ambitions and Northern finance, was recalled by the older slaves as having had happier times. Samson was unique in this community. He was taller than most men of his time, 6'4", but that wasn't because of his size. Rather, it was because of his peculiar past. 3 years prior, Rutledge had bought him from a Louisiana plantation that had gone bankrupt, and the bill of sale included odd information like strong constitution, unusual physical capabilities, possible medical anomaly. Despite Samson's evident worth as a field worker, the vendor, Budrow, a Frenchman, had been keen to let him go. Buyer assumes all risks. Samson never mentioned his former life, but the other slaves observed that he was able to work 16-hour days in the cotton fields without showing signs of exhaustion, that he could lift cotton bales that normally required 2 men, and that his hands had calluses so thick and developed that they looked almost like horn. The plantation blacksmith, Jupiter, an enslaved man, swore that Samson could bend horseshoes with his bare hands, though he was careful never to show such skills in front of the overseer. However, it was not just his physical prowess that distinguished him. Others claimed to have seen him scratching symbols in the dirt outside his cabin late at night. Not English letters, but something else entirely. Something that appeared almost like formulas. Colonel Rutledge took a particular interest in Samson, though not out of kindness. The colonel had heard rumors about the slave's unusual capabilities and saw an opportunity for both profit and scientific inquiry. Rutledge fancied himself a man of learning, a subscriber to phrenology journals and agricultural periodicals that discussed the natural variations in human specimens. He began conducting what he called strength assessments on Samson, timing his work, measuring his output, and documenting his capabilities in leather-bound journals kept locked in his study. These sessions took place in the plantation's old carriage house, away from prying eyes. Rutledge would have Samson lift increasingly heavy objects, anvils, tree trunks, even sections of iron machinery, while he took notes and made calculations. The colonel was particularly fascinated by what appeared to be Samson's ability to work without fatigue, often pushing him for hours beyond the point where normal men would collapse. By the fall of 1857, however, these evaluations had become more somber. Rutledge had started allowing visitors to observe what he called his demonstrations, in which affluent planters from nearby counties came to see the slave who was said to be capable of feats of impossible strength. Some of these demonstrations involved lifting competitions, while others required Samson to break thick wooden planks with his bare hands or bend iron bars. However, as Thanksgiving drew near, the other slaves were the first to notice a change in Samson's demeanor, a distant look in his eyes, as if he were calculating something. Jupiter, the blacksmith, later informed investigators that Samson had started asking odd questions about the plantation's layout, Colonel Rutledge's habits, and which house servants had access to which areas of the mansion. The Rutledge household was preparing for what the colonel planned to be his grandest Thanksgiving celebration yet. He'd invited over 40 guests from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans, including several who'd specifically requested to see his remarkable specimen. The menu had been planned for weeks, with special delicacies ordered from as far away as Baltimore. Most importantly, Colonel Rutledge had planned a special after-dinner demonstration featuring Samson, one that he promised would astound his guests and cement his reputation as Arkansas's most forward-thinking plantation owner. What Rutledge didn't know was that Samson had been listening. The house servants, moving invisibly through the mansion as they prepared for the celebration, had overheard conversations about the planned demonstration. More disturbing still, they'd glimpsed some of Colonel Rutledge's private journals, left carelessly open in his study. The entries they'd seen spoke of terminal experiments, ultimate strength limitations, and acceptable losses in the name of scientific advancement. Colonel Rutledge and Samson were making their last preparations as Thanksgiving Day 1857 broke clear over the Arkansas bottomlands. Neither man realized that before the night was over, one of them would be dead and the other would disappear into the Arkansas wilderness, leaving behind only questions that would haunt Pulaski County for generations to come. On November 26, 1857, Thanksgiving at Rutledge Plantation started off like any other Thanksgiving, but those who knew where to look could not help but notice the undercurrents of tension. By dawn, the kitchen of the mansion was bustling with frantic preparation as house slaves worked under the watchful eye of Molly Kittenden, the head cook, preparing a feast that would seat 50 guests in the plantation's grand dining room. Samson had been tasked with helping to prepare the grounds, setting up extra seating on the mansion's wraparound veranda, and making sure the oil lamps were filled and positioned for the evening's entertainment. However, those who worked with him noticed something different, an economy of movement, as if he were saving his strength for something specific. Colonel Rutledge spent the morning in his study going over his notes and getting ready for what he had privately called the grand demonstration. His journals from that day, turned up decades later when the mansion was being demolished, showed how excited he was to show his guests what he thought would be the final evidence of his theories regarding the physical limitations of humans. "Today I shall push the specimen beyond all previous thresholds. Read the final entry, which was written in his meticulous script that morning. Nothing less than total comprehension is required by science." The guests began arriving around noon, their carriages creating a steady stream along the plantation's Oak Line Drive. Among them were some of the most prominent names in Arkansas society: Judge Cornelius Dillingham from Little Rock, plantation owner Samuel Vaughn from Helena, and Dr. Nathaniel Payton, a physician from Memphis who'd gained notoriety for his writings on racial physiognomy. But the guest who drew the most attention was Professor Emanuel Voss, a German immigrant who claimed expertise in what he called physical anthropology, and who traveled from as far as St. Louis to witness Rutledge's famous slave. As the afternoon progressed, and the guests enjoyed their pre-dinner drinks on the veranda, Samson continued his preparations with the methodical precision of a man following a carefully rehearsed plan. Jupiter, the blacksmith, later told investigators that when he tried to engage Samson in conversation around 3, The larger man had looked at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. As the evening drew to a close, Colonel Rutledge stood to address his guests, his face flushed with wine and anticipation. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "tonight you will witness something that challenges everything we thought we knew about the limits of human capability." The dinner itself went off without incident, and the guests feasted on roasted turkey, sugar-cured ham, cornbread stuffing, and an array of seasonal vegetables, all of which were prepared by expert hands that moved invisibly between kitchen and dining room. Samson, my specimen, will exhibit abilities that were thought to be unthinkable only a generation ago. With a mixture of excitement and skepticism, the guests followed Rutledge out to the old carriage house, where candles had been set up around the building's perimeter, creating dancing shadows against the weathered wooden walls. Inside, the room was empty except for a variety of testing equipment, including wooden beams, iron bars of varying thicknesses, and what looked like sections of railroad iron set on heavy wooden blocks. Samson was already waiting inside, his enormous frame silhouetted against the torchlight, but something about his stance, his shoulder grip, and the angle of his head suggested a readiness that went beyond simple physical preparation. Dr. Peyton, the Memphis physician, later wrote in his private diary that night that watching Samson was like looking at a spring wound to its breaking point. All controlled energy waiting to be released. Colonel Rutledge began with his usual demonstrations. Samson lifted weights that should have been impossible for any man, bent iron bars that should have required machinery, and split thick oak beams with his bare hands while the guests watched in amazement. Professor Voss took copious notes, muttering in German and occasionally asking Rutledge to repeat certain tests. But as the evening progressed, Rutledge's demands became more extreme. He ordered Samson to lift heavier weights, bend thicker iron, break harder wood. The guests, initially impressed, began to show signs of discomfort as they realized they were witnessing what amounted to systematic torture disguised as scientific inquiry. It was Judge Dillingham who first noticed the change in Samson's expression. Around 10:30, as Rutledge ordered him to attempt lifting what appeared to be a section of railroad rail, something shifted in the slave's demeanor. The careful compliance, the measured responses, all of it vanished, replaced by something that made the judge step backward involuntarily. "Colonel," Dillingham muttered, "maybe we've seen enough for one evening." Rutledge, however, dismissed the idea, engrossed in the thrill of his presentation and his guests' attentiveness. "Nonsense. The genuinely intriguing milestones are just around the corner." He pointed to a huge piece of equipment that had been hauled into the carriage house earlier that day. The iron flywheel from a cotton gin, which weighed about 400 pounds. "Samson, I want you to try something we've never tried before," he said. Samson gazed at the flywheel, then at Colonel Rutledge, then at the group of anticipatory faces that surrounded them, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that a few guests had to bend forward to hear him say, "No, sir." The simple denial struck the assembly like a physical blow because, in the antebellum South, a slave's direct defiance of a master's command was unimaginable, a violation so complete that it demanded an immediate and violent response. However, something in Samson's tone, in the way he held himself, caused everyone to pause, and Colonel Rutledge's face moved through a range of emotions, including surprise, anger, and finally a chilly rage that his guests had never seen before. "I said, no, sir." Samson's voice remained silent, but something beneath it had changed, causing Judge Dillingham to take another step back and Professor Voss to stop writing in his notebook. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two men faced each other across the torchlit room. Then Samson smiled, and several of the witnesses later swore that they had never seen an expression more terrifying in their lives. "No, sir," he said one last time. "I don't believe I will." "You will do as I command," Rutledge said, his voice tight with rage. "Or you'll face consequences that will make our previous sessions seem like gentle encouragement." What happened next unfolded with a speed that left most witnesses struggling to process what they'd seen. Samson moved toward Colonel Rutledge, with the fluid grace of a man half his size, covering the distance between them in 3 impossibly quick strides. Rutledge had time to raise his hands defensively, time to open his mouth in what might have been a shout or a plea, but no time to escape what was coming. The sound that followed, described by multiple witnesses as resembling a thick branch breaking in a strong wind, would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Colonel Jeremiah Rutledge, master of 3,000 acres and nearly 200 human souls, died instantly as his neck snapped with an audible crack that seemed to echo in the sudden silence. But it wasn't just the killing that terrorized the witnesses. It was the ease of it. Samson had killed his master with no more effort than a normal man might use to break a stick for kindling. For a moment that felt frozen in time, he stood over Rutledge's body, his massive hands still positioned as if he were holding something delicate that had simply broken. Then he looked up at the circle of horrified faces, and when he spoke, his voice carried an intelligence and education that no slave was supposed to possess. "Gentlemen," he said, with perfect diction and a slight accent that none of them could identify, "I suggest you leave now." The stampede that followed was anything but dignified. Prominent citizens of Arkansas society trampled each other in their haste to escape the carriage house, abandoning all pretense of social standing in their panic to reach their carriages and flee into the night. Within minutes, Rutledge Plantation was empty, except for the slaves in their quarters, the body of their former master, and Samson, who stood alone among the scattered testing apparatus and flickering torches. What happened in the hours that followed remains one of the great mysteries of that terrible night. The house slaves, terrified and uncertain, remained in their quarters until dawn. When they finally emerged, they found the carriage house empty, the torches burned out, and Colonel Rutledge's body gone. Samson had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only the deep handprints pressed into the oak beams where he demonstrated his strength, and a plantation full of people who suddenly found themselves without a master, without direction, and without any idea what came next. However, the disappearance of Samson and the body was just the beginning. Within hours, telegrams were sent, riders were sent to Little Rock, and officials started to arrive at the plantation. What they discovered sparked an investigation that would consume the local authorities for months and leave questions that still exist today. The immediate aftermath of that Thanksgiving night caused chaos in Pulaski County, and by the morning of November 27th, word had spread through the network of overseers, plantation owners, and county officials who made up the backbone of Arkansas society. The implications were profound, not just because a slave had killed his master, but also because Samson had disappeared so completely, and the witnesses were so traumatized. Judge Cornelius Dillingham, one of the state's most esteemed legal minds, returned to Little Rock in what his clerk called complete nervous prostration. Dr. Nathaniel Payton, the physician from Memphis, checked himself into a private sanitarium and refused to discuss the events for more than a year. Professor Voss simply vanished, leaving behind only a trunk full of notes written in what seemed to be a combination of German and some sort of mathematical notation that no one could decipher. Sheriff Thomas Brage arrived at Rutledge Plantation at first light, expecting to find a crime scene, evidence of violence, perhaps an ongoing slave revolt, and undoubtedly some indication of where Samson might have fled. When questioned, the house slaves gave utterly useless and frustratingly constant answers. Yes, they had heard raised voices from the carriage house around 10:30. No, they had not investigated. Yes, they had seen lights moving around the plantation late into the night, but from their quarters, they couldn't determine who might have been carrying them or where they were going. Most frustrating of all, the slaves appeared almost incapable of providing useful descriptions when asked about Samson himself. He was tall, they agreed. He was strong, certainly. But when asked about his personality, his habits, and his relationships with other slaves, they became evasive and vague in ways that suggested either genuine confusion about who Samson had been or intentional concealment. The most frank witness was Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith, whose testimony raised more questions than it did answers. Under Sheriff Breage's pressure, Jupiter acknowledged that Samson had possessed unusual strength, far beyond what any normal man should have been able to do. But his explanation became more bizarre when he was asked specific questions. He could work all day without getting tired. Jupiter testified, his hands twitching uneasily in his lap, but it wasn't natural tired. You get it? And sometimes, late at night, I'd see him doing things that didn't make sense. What kind of things? It was like he was powered by something different than the rest of us. He would be working with numbers, scratching them in the dirt, but they weren't like any numbers I've ever seen. Sheriff Brage pressed. Occasionally, he would converse with himself in a language other than English. Something that sounded like he was giving orders, not just talking, like he was used to being in charge of things, Jupiter said, pausing, obviously unsure of how to explain what he had seen. Sheriff Brage organized search parties that combed the Arkansas bottomlands for miles in every direction, dragged ponds, searched abandoned buildings, followed every creek and river in a 20-mile radius. But Samson appeared to have disappeared as completely as morning mist, leaving no trace of his passage. The physical evidence at the plantation was equally perplexing. The carriage house bore obvious signs of the previous night's activities, including broken wooden beams, bent iron bars, and scattered weights. However, despite the violent nature of Colonel Rutledge's death, there was no blood, no obvious footprints leading away from the building, and no obvious footprints leading away from the building. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation became more desperate, and Governor Elias Conway, under pressure from powerful plantation owners across the state, approved a $500 reward for information that led to Samson's capture, a huge sum that attracted bounty hunters from as far away as Memphis and New Orleans. Wanted posters appeared all over the Arkansas Territory and neighboring states, with a description so general that it could have been applied to dozens of men. Large Negro male, approximately 6'4" tall, unusually strong build, answers to the name Samson, extremely dangerous. Approach with caution. However, as the weeks went by, a more concerning trend started to emerge. Numerous bounty hunters who had taken up the search described odd experiences in the Arkansas wilderness, including sightings of an unnaturally tall figure moving through the woods at night, campsites that seemed to have been occupied by a very strong person, and trees that had been uprooted or bent in ways that suggested superhuman force. The stories that started to come in from other areas of the state were much more alarming. Another planter near Helena reported that his overseer abruptly quit after learning that the slaves were discussing the strong man who was coming to set things right. A plantation owner near Pine Bluff reported that his slaves had started acting strangely, whispering among themselves, and displaying signs of what he called dangerous excitement. By Christmas 1857, Arkansas law enforcement was somewhat embarrassed by the Samson probe. They were no closer to locating their fugitive than they had been on Thanksgiving night, even with the extensive manhunt, the sizable prize, and the participation of federal marshals. Even worse, Northern publications were starting to draw unwelcome attention to the case by publishing sensationalized stories about the Arkansas Superman who had allegedly murdered his master and disappeared. The earliest attempts at an official cover-up started to appear during this time. Governor Conway discreetly had all official records of the investigation concealed because he was worried about the case's potential to worsen tensions between the North and South and the effect it would have on Arkansas's reputation. Newspapers were dissuaded from publishing any more articles on the case, the wanted posters were taken down, and the reward was revoked. The most important development, however, came from an unexpected place: the private documents of Colonel Rutledge. His executives found something that had been missed in the first investigation when his estate was eventually settled in early 1858. A set of documents concealed under a fake bottom of the colonel's desk indicated that his interest in Samson had transcended mere scientific curiosity. These included letters to a number of northern universities, in which human experimentation and physical enhancement studies were discussed in detail, as well as receipts for chemical compounds ordered from laboratories in Boston and New York, substances whose names meant nothing to local investigators, but which suggested scientific or medical uses. Among the most interesting was a bill of lading from a New Orleans shipping company, dated only 2 weeks prior to Samson's arrival at the plantation, for specialized pharmaceutical equipment and associated materials. The last document in this secret collection was possibly the most unsettling: a contract with a Boston-based company, Meridian Research Associates, for ongoing physiological assessment and enhancement protocols. The contract was signed by Colonel Rutledge and a person known only as Subject S, in handwriting that several house slaves recognized as being that of Samson. Nobody in Arkansas was ready to respond to the questions these findings brought up. Was Samson involved in a medical experiment of some kind? Had Colonel Rutledge been developing new methods of human improvement in collaboration with Northern interests? If so, how did that affect our comprehension of what happened on Thanksgiving night in 1857? The government's reaction to these disclosures was prompt and forceful. Classified as sensitive estate materials, the records were placed in federal possession after being sealed by a court order. The executives took an oath of confidentiality. All reference to Meridian Research Associates was removed from official documents, and the house slaves who had recognized Samson's handwriting were discreetly sold to plantations in far-off states. However, rumors continued to circulate through the underground networks that linked slave communities across the South. Tales of the strong man who had broken his chains and vanished into legend. Stories of conspiracies in the North and government experiments, and rumors about other plantations where similar specimens might be receiving similar treatment, and what might occur if they, too, decided they had had enough. The Samson case formally ended as 1858 broke out over Arkansas. However, the issues posed by one Thanksgiving night kept growing in the locked files of federal offices in Washington, in the private correspondence of anxious plantation owners, and in slave quarters across the South. And others who said they saw Samson insisted that he was still out there, getting stronger, waiting, and perhaps preparing something that would make his acts at Rutledge Plantation seem like the beginning, somewhere in the wide wilderness of the Arkansas region. New information that emerged in the spring of 1858 would add to the mystery surrounding Samson's disappearance and cast doubt on the actual circumstances surrounding what had happened at Rutledge Plantation. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, which had been covertly engaged by unidentified parties to carry out their own investigation into the events of Thanksgiving night, provided the first clue that the case was far from over. In March, Allen Pinkerton himself and two of his most seasoned agents arrived in Little Rock. The Pinkertons were curious about what had transpired prior to Samson's arrival at Rutledge Plantation. In contrast to the local authorities who had concentrated their efforts on following his activities following the murder, they would follow a trail that led back to Louisiana, Mississippi, and finally to a number of northeastern medical institutes that had been engaged in what they euphemistically referred to as human improvement research. The initial bill of sale that had brought Samson to Arkansas was the starting point of the Pinkerton inquiry. In order to interrogate the initial slave trader, the Frenchman named Boudreaux, Detective James Hawthorne traveled to Louisiana pretending to be a prospective purchase. What he found was quite disturbing. Under the aegis of the so-called Southern Health Initiative, Boudreaux's plantation, which is situated in the bayou country south of New Orleans, had been the site of numerous medical studies. The program had been trying several chemical compounds and medical procedures intended to improve human physical capacities, despite its apparent purpose of studying ailments prevalent among enslaved populations. As Hawthorne wrote in his classified report to Pinkerton, "The Frenchman was nervous from the moment I mentioned Samson's name. Boudreaux claims that the Southern Health Initiative was financed by a group of Northern investors who were interested in creating more effective labor systems. He kept insisting that he had disclosed all known risks in the bill of sale, that he bore no responsibility for what happened afterward. But when pressed, he admitted that Samson had been part of what he called the enhancement protocol for more than 2 years before the sale. The majority of participants in the trials shown very slight increases in strength and endurance after being exposed to a variety of pharmacological treatments, closely watched exercise routines, and what were referred to as nutritional optimization protocols. Some underwent significant transformations, and a select few, like Samson, started exhibiting talents that appeared to go beyond typical human bounds. But there were side effects, Boudreaux had told the detective from Pinkerton. Samson was among the worst, or the best, depending on your perspective. He was able to read and write in a matter of months, began to comprehend complicated mathematical ideas, and began to ask questions regarding the nature of the treatments he was receiving. The enhanced subjects began to show signs of independence. They became harder to control, more questioning of authority, and some of them began to display intellectual capabilities that were most disturbing. When a number of augmented subjects escaped during a revolt in 1854 that resulted in the deaths of 3 overseers, the Louisiana experiments were immediately closed. While the majority of the fugitives had been apprehended and discreetly disposed of, some, like Samson, had been sold to far-off plantations with carefully worded disclaimers regarding their peculiar traits. The Pinkertons looked into the northern ties to the Southern Health Initiative as a result of this discovery. What they found was a system of hospitals, universities, and private labs that had been carrying out identical trials during the 1,840 seconds and 1,850 seconds. Funding for the project came from a mix of government contracts, private investors, and what seemed to be military interests looking to create enhanced soldiers for possible future wars. Dr. Marcus Kleinman, a German immigrant who had founded research institutions in Boston, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, was the main player in this network. In order to produce people with improved capacities, Kleinman's research concentrated on human optimization, which he defined as the process of combining pharmacological treatments, physical conditioning, and psychological conditioning. Prisons, immigrant communities, and increasingly enslaved people bought expressly for his experiments served as his test subjects. One of Pinkerton's most talented female agents, Detective Sarah Chen, entered Kleinman's Boston facility by pretending to be a job-seeking nurse. Her reports demonstrated the enhancement program's breadth and depth. The facility maintains detailed records on over 200 subjects who have undergone various levels of enhancement treatment, she stated. However, Chen's access to Kleinman's private correspondence revealed the most unsettling finding. The success rate varies dramatically depending on the subject's physical condition, psychological profile, and what they refer to as genetic compatibility factors. Successful subjects show increases in physical strength ranging from 50% to, in extraordinary cases, over 300% of baseline human capability. Colonel Rutledge had been in constant contact with the doctor, who had been given thorough updates on Samson's development and advice on how to best utilize the subject's potential. The letters were even more concerning since they disclosed that Rutledge's Thanksgiving demonstration had been organized collaboratively with Kleinman as the ultimate test of Samson's improvement. One of Kleinman's correspondences stated, "The subject has reached the limits of our current understanding. The demonstration you have planned will provide crucial data about the psychological breaking points of enhanced subjects. We must understand what happens when they are pushed beyond all reasonable limits. The implications for future military applications are enormous." Unexpectedly, Jupiter, the plantation blacksmith who had kept in touch with a number of the Pinkerton agents via a network of free blacks in Little Rock, provided the last piece of the puzzle. Jupiter revealed material in late April that showed Samson had not just disappeared, but had spent months planning his escape. Jupiter disclosed he had been making arrangements in a secret meeting. This discovery prompted a more thorough examination of what seemed to be an underground network devoted to assisting enhanced subjects in escaping their captivity. There were people who knew about him, people who had been waiting for the right time. The night he killed the colonel wasn't random, it was planned. And there were others involved, people who helped him get away. The network, which referred to itself as the Freedom Chain, was made up of free blacks, abolitionists, and even some benevolent white people who had learned about the enhancement trials and saw them as a monstrosity that went beyond the typical atrocities of slavery. Since the early 1,850 seconds, the Freedom Chain has assisted fugitive enhanced subjects in finding refuge in Canada, Mexico, or isolated regions of the American wilderness. They had created advanced techniques for hiding their tracks, creating fictitious identities, and above all, assisting the boosted subjects in learning how to manage their powers so they could fit in with the rest of society. The most startling discovery, however, was made in May 1858, when Detective Hawthorne discovered proof that foreign agents had penetrated the Freedom Chain. Correspondence with British and French intelligence officers interested in American augmentation technology was discovered in documents recovered during a raid on a suspected safe house in Memphis. The implications are staggering, Pinkerton wrote in his last report to his enigmatic patrons. The Pinkerton investigation was quietly closed in June 1858, its findings classified and its operatives reassigned to other cases. The enhancement program has not only created individuals with capabilities that exceed normal human limitations, but it has also attracted the attention of foreign powers who see potential military applications. If subjects like Samson have been successfully extracted to foreign territory, we may be facing a situation where America's enemies possess capabilities that we do not fully understand or control. However, the questions it had brought up persisted in some Washington circles, where government experts and military leaders started to consider the ramifications of what they had discovered. Reports of an unfathomably tall and powerful figure moving through the wilderness, stories from isolated communities about a mysterious benefactor who had aided runaway slaves in achieving freedom, and stories from Native American tribes about a man who could outrun horses and bend iron with his bare hands, but spoke with intelligence and kindness instead of the savage fury that many expected from someone of his abilities, were all still coming in. And in the former Rutledge plantation's ruins, which are now deserted and gradually being reclaimed by the Arkansas wilderness, tourists have noted odd occurrences like deep handprints in oak beams that appear to get stronger over time rather than softer, places where the ground itself appeared to have been compressed by tremendous force. And occasionally, on calm nights when the wind was still, the sound of someone passing through the old carriage house, as though a huge figure were trying to test his strength against unseen weights. 1 year after the Thanksgiving night that had turned everything upside down, the mystery of Samson had grown from a local manhunt to something far more intricate and expansive when summer gave way to fall in 1858. His true identity, what had happened to him, and the potential consequences of his escape for a country already dividing along lines of slavery, freedom, and the central question of what it meant to be human were the new questions, in addition to where he had gone. If this tale is chilling you, show this film to a friend who enjoys dark mysteries. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Arkansas intensifies. Please click the like button to show your support for our work. And remember to subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. The most horrific revelations are yet to come, so let's find out together what happens next. Powerful people's perceptions of the Samson case were indelibly altered by a string of events that occurred in the fall of 1858. What started out as sporadic accounts of odd happenings across Arkansas and the surrounding states eventually came together to form a pattern that pointed to something much more coordinated and perilous than a lone runaway slave lurking in the Recton, Arkansas. The woods. The first significant event happened in October in southern Arkansas, close to the town of Camden. A plantation belonging to one of the state's leading cotton growers, Marcus Henley, had what witnesses called a night of impossible terror. Henley had just purchased 3 new slaves from a Louisiana dealer, men who had the same enigmatic markings on their bill of sale that had previously described Samson, unusual physical capabilities, and possible medical anomaly. Known only as Caesar, Goliath, and Titan in plantation records, these 3 men escaped out of the plantation's most secure holding facility at the same time on the evening of October 15th. However, this was no ordinary escape attempt. James Huckabee, the supervisor who survived, said the 3 men did not break the locks on their shackles. As though they were made of clay, they used their bare hands to twist thick iron bands apart, breaking the shackles themselves. The 3 enhanced slaves had methodically destroyed every piece of restraint equipment on the plantation, including their own bonds, every chain, every lock, and every iron bar that could be used to confine humans. "I've been managing slaves for 20 years, Huckabee told investigators, "and I've never seen anything like what happened that night. These men moved like they could see in the dark, coordinated like they'd been planning this for years instead of days. And the strength, God help me, the strength was inhuman. Until they were prepared to depart, they had carried out their devastation in total silence, not even waking the house slaves or warning the guards. In addition to their personal freedom, they brought with them provisions that indicated they were planning a far longer voyage than a simple escape to the next county, as well as thorough maps of the surrounding area that they had somehow obtained. However, the events in Camden were only the start. Similar stories started coming in from plantations all across the area in a matter of weeks. Equipment that had been twisted into abstract sculptures of bent metal and shattered wood was left behind when two augmented subjects in Mississippi broke out of a research facility near Natchez. Before breaking out of what was supposedly a escape-proof holding facility in Louisiana, a group of 4 augmented persons methodically destroyed all of the program's research notes and documents. The pattern was frightening and obvious. There was more to the augmented subjects' escape than chance. Some central authority who knew exactly where they were being held and how to free them was coordinating and directing them. Even more unsettling is the fact that they appear to have insider knowledge of the enhancement program itself, as evidenced by their precise destruction of particular sorts of evidence and targeting of particular facilities. In November, Dr. Marcus Kleinman, the German researcher who had played a key role in creating the augmentation techniques, came to Little Rock to discuss the escalating situation with federal officials. His evaluation was somber and grew more frantic. In a classified briefing to military leaders, he stated, "We are dealing with subjects who have been fundamentally altered. Not just physically, but intellectually." The psychological profiles of enhanced subjects were Kleinman's most unsettling discovery. The enhancement process appears to have created individuals with capabilities that extend far beyond our original parameters. They are displaying strategic thinking, coordination abilities, and problem-solving skills that suggest we may have inadvertently created a form of enhanced intelligence. His studies revealed that the physical and chemical therapies that improved their stamina and strength also seemed to remove some of the mental obstacles that often restricted human potential. Enhanced subjects had higher learning speeds, greater memory capacity, and most concerning of all, a shared consciousness that seemed to enable them to coordinate their actions over great distances. "We believe," Kleinman stated in his confidential study, "that we may have accidentally created a new form of human being, one that views ordinary humans not as equals, but as inferior." The implications for social control, for the entire structure of our society, are catastrophic. As police started to think that Samson was not simply another fugitive, but rather the coordinating intelligence behind the expanding network of augmented persons, the search for him had gained new urgency. In the days preceding mass escapes, reports from all around the Arkansas Territory detailed sightings of an unnaturally tall figure who showed up at farms and research institutions, seemingly on reconnaissance trips to plot future operations. The most in-depth description of an encounter with what he thought was Samson himself came from bounty hunter Thomas Bogard, who had been pursuing enhanced people since the Camden event. Bogard said he confronted the fugitive in a lonely canyon in late November while tracking traces near the Buffalo River in northern Arkansas. Bogard told U.S. agents, "He was standing on a ledge about 30 feet above me, and I knew immediately that this wasn't someone I could take alive. The size of him was inhuman. He had to be close to 7 feet tall and built like he could tear a tree out of the ground. But it wasn't his size that scared me. It was his eyes. He looked at me like he was calculating exactly how long it would take to kill me and whether it was worth the effort." Bogard claimed that Samson had spoken to him in flawless English with a well-educated accent. Samson's decision to leave rather than fight was the only reason the encounter ended peacefully. "He told me that I was hunting the wrong prey," the bounty hunter recalled. "He said that men like him weren't the problem. We were. He said that for too long people had been treated like property, like animals to be experimented on and discarded. He said that was going to change, whether we wanted it to or not." Bogard said, "He just stepped backward off that ledge, and when I climbed up to see where he'd gone, there was nothing. No tracks, no sign he'd ever been there. Just those deep handprints in the rock where he'd been gripping the stone." As the enhanced subject situation worsened by December 1858, President James Buchanan was being regularly briefed on what his advisors had started referring to as the Samson crisis. The ramifications were profound, encompassing not only the immediate security issues, but also the more general issues of states' rights, human experimentation, and the essence of freedom and slavery that were already tearing the nation apart. Military leaders started creating backup plans for what they dubbed enhanced subject containment operations. However, their preparations were hampered by the unsettling discovery that they were unsure of the precise number of enhanced individuals that had been produced over the years, their locations, and their potential future capabilities. The numerous research initiatives had been carried out covertly, with little coordination and almost no central documentation. "We may be facing a situation," General Winfield Scott wrote in a classified note to the Department of War, "where our own scientific ambitions have created a threat that we are fundamentally unprepared to address." These enhanced subjects appear to possess not only superior physical capabilities but also tactical intelligence that makes them extremely difficult to track or contain. If they are indeed being coordinated by a central authority, possibly this Samson figure, then we may be dealing with what amounts to an insurgency led by individuals who are virtually superhuman. On New Year's Eve, the last incident of 1858 took place in a secluded research site in eastern Tennessee. The military-run institution, tucked away in the Cumberland Mountains, has been testing augmentation techniques on volunteer soldiers who were promised increased stamina and strength in return for their service. Even President Buchanan was not aware of the program's existence because it had been so classified. According to survivors, the facility was attacked on the evening of December 31st by a coordinated force of enhanced individuals, led by someone matching Samson's description. The attack was not a haphazard assault, but rather a well-thought-out military operation that indicated considerable reconnaissance and tactical planning. "They knew exactly where everything was," said Major William Kittenden, commanding officer of the institution. "They disabled our communications first, then systematically destroyed all research materials and freed subjects. The entire operation took less than 2 hours, and they accomplished it without killing a single person, though they made it very clear that they could have eliminated all of us if they had chosen to do so." The most unsettling part of the Tennessee raid was the message left behind. It was carved in letters 2 inches deep into the main laboratory wall of the facility. "The chains are broken. The strong shall no longer serve the weak. A new age begins." The message was signed with a single symbol, a picture of broken shackles, which investigators would later find had appeared at every location where enhanced subjects had escaped or been released. It was becoming evident that what had started out as sporadic instances of individual escapes had developed into something far more planned and perilous. A concerted rebellion headed by people whose skills far outstrip anything seen in human history. The Samson issue posed a fresh and unheard-of threat to the status quo as 1859 dawned over a country already dividing along lines of slavery and freedom. Not only did the augmented subjects want to be free, they seemed intent on systematically dismantling the entire system of human experimentation and bondage that had produced them. And in what was starting to resemble less a series of escapes and more the beginnings of a war that would test all Americans believed they knew about human nature, human rights, and the cost of treating people like property that could be bought, sold, and altered at will, Samson and his expanding army of enhanced followers were preparing their next move somewhere in the vast wilderness of the American frontier. In the spring of 1859, in a place no one could have predicted the nation's capital itself, came the encounter that would ultimately expose the full extent of the Samson conspiracy. What started out as a normal probe into discrepancies in government contracts would blow up into a crisis that threatened to reveal secrets that powerful individuals had killed to keep safe and reach the highest echelons of the federal government. The investigation started when long-standing anti-slavery Congressman Joshua Giddings of Ohio received an anonymous package with information outlining the entire scope of the augmentation program. Through a complicated web of government contracts, private investments, and military appropriations, the materials, which included hundreds of pages of correspondence, financial records, medical reports, and research notes, unveiled a network of human experimentation that extended from the Louisiana bayous to the laboratories of Boston. The document's most shocking discovery, however, was a list of augmented subjects that had been developed over almost 10 years of testing. More than 300 names were on the list, along with their locations, levels of enhancement, and most unsettling of all their present status: terminated, escaped, or detained. The name that had come to represent the entire problem, Samson, was at the top of the list, with special notations denoting both the highest enhancement level and active resistance leader status. Recognizing the magnitude of what he had been given, Congressman Giddings immediately called for congressional hearings into what he described as the systematic enslavement and torture of human beings in the name of scientific advancement. Southern representatives fiercely opposed Giddings' demands, claiming that any such investigation would violate states' rights and interfere with legitimate agricultural research. However, Giddings had allies among Northern representatives who were equally horrified by the revelations, and by April 1859, a select committee had been established to look into the enhancement program. On April 21, the Capitol building hosted the committee's first public hearing, which attracted record-breaking media coverage and sizable attendance. Even the most prepared observers were taken aback by the evidence of Dr. Marcus Kleinman, who was subpoenaed to testify about his involvement in the program. The enhancement protocol was initially intended as a humanitarian endeavor. Kleinman stated in his impassioned German testimony, "We never intended to create what we ultimately produced. We believed that by increasing the physical capabilities of enslaved individuals, we could reduce their suffering by making their labor more efficient and less physically demanding." Kleinman disclosed the full extent of the program's development in response to hostile questions from committee members. What started out as efforts to increase stamina and physical fitness had progressively developed into extensive studies of human alteration. In the end, enhanced subjects obtained talents that went beyond the typical human experience after being subjected to more harsh treatments and being forced to mental and physical limitations that no ethical researcher should have considered. The most damaging testimony, however, came from Dr. Kleinman's admission that the program had been expanded beyond enslaved subjects to include prisoners, immigrants, and eventually volunteer soldiers who had not been fully informed about the risks they were accepting. The subject designated as Samson, Kleinman acknowledged, represented our most successful and most dangerous outcome. His physical capabilities were approximately 400% of baseline human norms. His intellectual development exceeded our most optimistic projections, and his psychological profile indicated a level of independence and leadership potential that made him fundamentally unsuitable for continued bondage. The enhancement program had spread into a larger system of human experimentation that went against every medical ethics and individual rights standard, although being first justified as study on a people that was already oppressed. The military and intelligence uses of the augmentation program were the main topic of the committee's second day of hearings. During his closed session testimony, General Winfield Scott disclosed that the War Department had been supporting augmentation research since 1852 inches, an effort to develop soldiers capable of performing tasks that were beyond the scope of human ability and operating in harsh environments. The enhanced subjects showed promise for special operations, reconnaissance missions, and combat situations where superior physical capabilities would provide decisive advantages, Scott said in testimony. According to Scott's testimony, the military had tried to produce its own enhanced subjects using volunteer soldiers, but the results had been disastrous. However, we quickly discovered that the psychological changes that accompanied physical enhancement made these subjects unsuitable for military discipline. They became increasingly resistant to authority, increasingly likely to make independent decisions, and increasingly sympathetic to causes that conflicted with military objectives. Unprecedented numbers of enhanced soldiers had fled, frequently bringing sensitive information with them. At least 2 had been put to death for what amounted to mutiny, and more had been court-martialed for disobeying instructions. In 1857, the military augmentation program was secretly discontinued, but not before producing scores of boosted people whose present locations were unknown. The committee's announcement that they had received a communication from Samson himself on April 25th marked the culmination of the congressional hearings. Delivered through intermediaries whose identities were kept under wraps, the message was a formal declaration that would be printed in newspapers across the country and read into the congressional record. The message started, "To the representatives of the American people, then. I write to you not as a former slave, not as an escaped fugitive, but as a free man who has broken the chains that bound not just my body, but my mind and spirit as well. For too long, men like me have been treated as property to be bought and sold, as animals to be bred and modified, as subjects for experiments that no decent society should permit." The statement went on to describe Samson's experiences in the enhancement program, from his initial capture and sale to his eventual realization of what was happening to him and others like him. The most impactful part, however, discussed the wider ramifications of what the improved participants had learned about American culture. "Through the enhancement process, we have gained not just physical strength, but clarity of vision about the true nature of this nation's institutions," said the statement. "We have seen how easily men can be reduced to property when it serves economic interests. We have experienced how readily scientific advancement is used to justify the most degrading forms of human bondage. We have learned that the principles of freedom and equality that this nation claims to uphold are applied selectively based on calculations of power and profit rather than any consistent moral framework." The statement ended with a statement that sent shockwaves throughout the Capitol. "We, the enhanced subjects who have broken free from our bondage, do not seek revenge against those who created us. We seek justice. We demand the immediate termination of all human enhancement programs. We demand the freedom of all subjects currently held in research facilities. And we demand recognition of our status as free human beings, with rights equal to any other Americans. If these demands are not met, we will take whatever actions are necessary to secure our freedom and the freedom of others like us." In addition to Samson, more than 50 additional augmented subjects signed the message, forming what amounted to an official declaration of independence from a group of people who were extremely dangerous if they choose to use violence to accomplish their objectives. Representatives from the South responded immediately in a predictable manner, demanding that the enhanced subjects be found and apprehended at all costs. Even if the upgraded subject skills made them frightening, Northern politicians who were already sympathetic to abolitionist causes recognized their demands as essentially just. Another element driving the country toward civil war was the disagreement over how to handle the Samson problem. Under pressure from all quarters, President Buchanan approved a nationwide manhunt for augmented subjects. Units of the military were sent to search areas thought to be sheltering enhanced subjects. Even as these measures were being put into place, reports started coming in that suggested the enhanced subjects were no longer just hiding in the wilderness. Bounties were raised to previously unheard-of levels, and a special federal task force was established to coordinate the capture or elimination of what government officials were now referring to as enhanced insurgents. Reports of sightings were made close to the main cities of Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington. It appears that enhanced persons were undertaking reconnaissance missions in urban areas to obtain intelligence about military stations, government buildings, and research facilities. The problem reached its peak on the 15th of May, 1859, when Samson himself made an appearance in Washington, D.C. He made no effort to conceal or work covertly. He strolled freely through the Capitol streets. His enormous body and impossibly tall stature made him instantly recognizable to onlookers. He proceeded with total assurance, according to witnesses, as though he was not afraid of being apprehended or confronted. He went directly to the Capitol building and asked to speak with the legislative committee that was looking into the augmentation program. Naturally, the request was turned down. Samson wasn't a legitimate political figure. He was a runaway slave who was wanted for murder. However, his very presence in the nation's capital made it clear that the upgraded subjects were no longer hiding or fleeing. They were prepared to face their creators head-on. Samson's brief visit to Washington came to an end peacefully, but not without repercussions. He etched one last message into the marble steps of the Capitol building itself before departing the Capitol. It was a succinct but devastating message. The experiment is over. The specimens have become the scientists. By evening, Samson had disappeared as thoroughly as he had come, except for the deep gouges in marble that revealed his superhuman strength and the clear indication that the enhanced subjects were no longer willing to be the victims of other men's aspirations. They were capable of confronting anyone who stood in their way, and they had turned into active participants in their own fate. A direct conflict between the government that had produced the enhanced subjects and the enhanced subjects themselves was the final manifestation of the Samson dilemma. Samson and his followers' fate, as well as the future of individual rights, human experimentation, and the central question of what it meant to be human in a country already grappling with what freedom meant, would all depend on what transpired next. The Samson issue was resolved through a series of covert conversations that would change American policy about human experimentation and establish precedents that would impact government research for many years to come, rather than by violence or dramatic confrontation. Beginning in June 1859 and lasting the entire summer, the negotiations were carried out through middlemen and kept out of the public eye. The turning point came when President Buchanan, realizing that a military solution to the enhanced subject problem would probably result in massive casualties and unwelcome publicity, gave Secretary of War John Floyd permission to speak directly with Samson and his emissaries, despite the country's unavoidable drift towards civil war. Abolitionist leaders who had been covertly backing the augmented subjects, and federal officials who understood that force alone could not end the problem, were among the several middlemen who mediated the negotiations. By using these middlemen, Samson was able to make astonishingly complex and legally sound demands. He suggested a holistic approach that would address the current dilemma while establishing principles that would prevent similar situations in the future, as opposed to pursuing retribution against those who had developed and exploited the augmented subjects. The fundamental components of what came to be known as the Washington Compact, although its existence was never formally recognized by the public, were the prompt termination of all federally sponsored human enhancement research, the destruction of all research materials and subject records, and the provision of new identities and financial assistance for enhanced subjects who desired to reintegrate into society. Above all, the compact created what amounted to a distinct territory in the far-flung areas of Alaska, which was still Russian territory at the time, where improved subjects, who wished to live apart from the rest of society, could create their own settlements. Complex international discussions involving Russian officials keen to build American goodwill prior to Alaska's ultimate sale to the United States made the deal possible. A key player in the resolution was Dr. Marcus Kleinman, whose testimony before Congress had helped reveal the full extent of the augmentation program. He gave government physicians comprehensive medical data in return for freedom from punishment, enabling them to create therapies for enhanced individuals who wanted to lessen their powers and blend in with the general population. While not all enhanced people opted for this, those who did were able to lead somewhat regular lives while adopting meticulously crafted new identities. Extreme secrecy and coordination were needed to carry out the Washington Compact. Through the underground network that had been assisting them in avoiding capture, enhanced subjects across the country were contacted and given options on their destiny. In order to bring their augmented skills down to more bearable levels, those who opted for integration received new identities, financial assistance, and medical care. Those who opted for separation were taken to the designated territory in Alaska via a series of well-planned movements. Before deciding to separate, Samson made sure that every other upgraded subject had been presented with realistic options for their future. In August 1859, he sent his last letter to federal negotiators, displaying the moral clarity and intelligence that had enabled him to lead the enhanced subject resistance so successfully. "I have no desire to live among people who view individuals like me as either property to be owned or weapons to be controlled," wrote he. "But I also have no desire to see unnecessary suffering inflicted on either side of this conflict. The compact we have negotiated provides a path forward that respects the autonomy of all parties while preventing future tragedies. I hope that future generations will learn from the mistakes that created this situation and will treat all human beings with the dignity and respect that every person deserves." The Samson crisis's public conclusion was meticulously planned to reduce its influence on popular sentiment and national politics. With a report that admitted irregularities in some research programs but omitted specifics regarding the enhancement studies, the Senate probe was discreetly wrapped up. Key program participants, including Dr. Kleinman, were moved to isolated areas where they could carry out medical research under close supervision without having access to human subjects. Dispersed among the northern states, the augmented subjects who opted for integration led peaceful lives under false pretenses. Many went on to become prosperous farmers, artisans, or small company owners, and they were careful not to flaunt their improved skills too much. Some joined the Underground Railroad and used their skills to assist other enslaved people in escaping to freedom. Those who opted for separation built settlements in Alaska that were renowned for their fortitude, sagacity, and dedication to justice among the native populations of the region. These communities kept in touch with one another, and with some government representatives, acting as a resource that might be used in dire situations, as well as a reminder of the implications of the enhancement program. The Samson crisis's influence on federal policy on human experimentation was its greatest enduring effect. The first formal ethical guidelines for government-sponsored medical research were established by the Washington Compact, which included provisions that would later develop into the current system of informed consent and human subjects protection. Although these guidelines were initially kept under wraps, they had an impact on government research practices and helped avert similar crises in subsequent decades. Less than 2 years after the Samson crisis was resolved, the Civil War broke out, casting the augmentation program in a negative light. The tale of a few dozen enhanced people seemed insignificant in comparison to the enormous losses and societal unrest of that fight. The program's official documents were stored in archives that would not be accessed for more than a century after they were classified and subsequently forgotten. However, Samson and the improved subjects' influence went well beyond the short-term settlement of their predicament. The villages they founded in Alaska developed into hubs of knowledge and scientific advancement, creating cutting-edge methods in agriculture, engineering, and medicine that would eventually help the entire region. A few of the augmented subjects who opted for integration went on to play significant roles in the abolitionist struggle, utilizing their skills and distinct viewpoints to aid in the eradication of the slave system that had enabled their own exploitation. Most significantly, the Samson crisis showed that even the most advanced oppressive and exploitative regimes may be defeated by individual rights and human dignity. It was not as if the augmented individuals had just gotten out of their bonds. They had essentially questioned the presumptions that initially permitted such bondage. Samson's narrative turned into mythology rather than history as the years went by and the specifics of the augmentation program were forgotten by the government. However, the memory of the enhanced subjects was a reminder of both humanity's potential for cruelty and its capacity for redemption in some circles, such as among researchers who studied government ethics, civil rights advocates who battled against medical exploitation, and indigenous communities in Alaska who recalled the strange but honorable neighbors who had settled among them. For decades following the building's abandonment, the handprints left by Samson on the wood timbers of the carriage house at Rutledge Plantation served as a tangible reminder of the night when a crisis that altered American history was triggered by one man's refusal to accept deterioration. When they saw those markings, visitors to the remains frequently expressed amazement rather than terror, acknowledging the incredible power needed to confront an entire system of human exploitation as well as to break physical chains. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often arise not from supernatural forces, but from the willingness of ordinary people to treat others as less than human when it serves their interests. But it also shows us that human dignity and the desire for freedom are forces more powerful than any enhancement, any system of oppression, or any attempt to reduce people to property. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of our government? Leave your comment below and let us know what you think really happened to Samson and the other enhanced subjects. If you enjoyed this tale of hidden history and human resilience, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this story with someone who appreciates the complex and often disturbing truths of America's past. There are more forgotten chapters of our history waiting to be explored, and we'll be here to guide you through them. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another mystery that the powerful would prefer to keep buried.